I'd like to now introduce our second speaker for this session, Brian Earp. He's flown all the way from the US to be with us today, so we're very thankful for that. Brian is Associate Director of the Yale-Hastings Program in Ethics and Health Policy at Yale University and the Hastings Centre, and is also a Research Fellow at the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford. His work is cross-disciplinary, following training in philosophy, cognitive science, psychology, history, and sociology of science and medicine, and ethics. Some of us here may recall that Brian gave a highly enlightening talk on the subject of genital cutting in infants and children at our Healthcare and Secularism conference last year. We're delighted to welcome him here today to speak more on these themes and to update us on our work. Brian has also asked just to let you know that there are some graphic images in his presentation, so just bear that in mind. Thank you.
I'll give you a fair warning about the images, so don't worry about being taken by surprise. So I'm here from the US, and I want to update you with some news from my neck of the woods. It's distressing news, and the way I want to share it with you is just by way of a couple of headlines. So let me go back to November of 2018. This is when we learned that the federal ban on female genital mutilation in the United States was ruled unconstitutional by a judge. Now, I just want to check, how many people were aware of the fact that this happened in the US? Okay, just a handful. All right. So this was shocking to those who have been following these debates, and it wasn't clear exactly how this was going to play out. Shortly thereafter, the federal prosecutors signaled that they were going to appeal the decision, and then just last month, we heard that the Justice Department has declined to defend its own law against what's here being referred to as female circumcision, citing flaws. So what could be going on? How could it be that the federal law in the United States that prohibited female genital cutting for non-medical reasons could be ruled unconstitutional? I'll explain that and give some context for it by way of the following outline. Now, those of you who were at the Secular Medical Forum Healthcare Conference will recognize some of this material, but it's also updated since then in light of these recent events. So I'm going to argue that a collision course was set in 1996 when that federal law was first passed regarding different legal standards for female, male, and intersex forms of childhood genital cutting. And I'll explain intersex in a moment. This crash just happened in the federal ruling. So the background of this is that prominent defenders in the US of religious male circumcision have been expressing awareness over recent years that a zero-tolerance policy for FGM, including something called a ritual nick, which I'll describe, means that male circumcision might be seen as next in line for some form of regulation or restriction. It's currently not just legal, but totally unregulated in the United States. You don't have to have a medical license to perform a circumcision. So they've begun actively promoting what they regard as minor forms of FGM in mainstream bioethics and law journals, presumably as a way to create a buffer of protection around their favored cultural practice. Now, defenders of what they call female circumcision have been emboldened by these maneuvers, and they're now taking arguments directly from the male circumcision playbook to say, these are the reasons why our cultural and religious practices should be given equal consideration and tolerance. Now, the sex-based distinctions that are often raised to try to quarantine these two discussions apart from each other are beginning to break down along a number of dimensions. Transgender identities were recently mentioned, and I've decided to exclude those from the talk, but sex and gender is now becoming the sort of thing whereby clear lines delineating one group of persons from another are being questioned, and that has relevance for this legal discussion. So what I see happening now is that battle lines are beginning to form between those who are in favor of religious rights, including the perceived right to alter a child's genitals for religious reasons, versus those who are in favor of children's rights, who think that children should be protected from these kinds of procedures. I want to emphasize that the Religious Rights Alliance should not be underestimated. There's now active collaboration between defenders of both male and female genital cutting who are collaborating to try to see how they can create a tolerant environment for their shared interests. And as a result of this, there's a serious movement afoot to remove the protections that have been put in place over the last 30 years due to feminist activism and consciousness raising to protect girls from genital cutting. So these issues are going to rise or fall together, as I'll argue. As a result, I think a united front is needed, which argues that all children have a right to bodily integrity and to protection from medically unnecessary genital cutting, whether they're female, male, or intersex. Now, the idea that there's a collision course in law goes back at least to this paper by Dina Davis, who's a prominent American bioethicist and legal scholar. From 2001, she writes, "Federal and state laws criminalizing genital alteration on female minors are so broad that they cover even procedures significantly less substantial than newborn male circumcision." I'll describe those procedures later. A complete laissez-faire attitude toward one practice, coupled with total criminalization of the other, has troubling implications for the constitutional requirement in the US of equal protection, because the laws appear to protect little girls, but not little boys, from religious and culturally motivated surgery. Well, it's not just little girls and little boys that we should be thinking about. This is a representation of what's sometimes called an intersex spectrum, or differences of sex development, or variations of sex characteristics, and some children who have genitalia that are neither stereotypically male nor female grow up to identify as intersex. There are different estimates for the frequency of these kinds of births. 1 in 1,500 or 2,000 is a common estimate. Now, here's the legal problem. Over on the left-hand side of the spectrum, it's currently considered legal and permissible to cut a child's genitals non-consensually and without a medical need, just so long as their genitals fall on the left-hand side of the spectrum. If you move over to the right-hand side of the spectrum, you have more stereotypically female genitalia, and the current situation is that in all of the same Western countries that allow male circumcision, any form of cutting on female genital tissue that isn't medically required is criminally prohibited. So I want to clarify that this isn't just what you might imagine as rusty razor blades in a remote African village, or the sort of image that's often held up in the Western media. What I mean is any cutting. So no matter how superficial, whether it's done with sterile instruments or not, whether the parents believe it's a religious obligation or otherwise, all such procedures are currently criminally forbidden. And now you have the case in the middle here of intersex cases. The legal status is increasingly being questioned. Some such interventions are medically required to help the child pass urine, but other cases are what you might think of as cosmetic or socially driven, so it's to mold the child's body into a more stereotypically male or female appearance. There's recently been a law proposed in California to ban such cosmetic procedures. This creates a conundrum, which I want to phrase in this way, which is, you have to excuse the graphic, it's adjusting to Windows. I put this together on a Mac. But the question is, at what point does a small penis, which is legal to cut, become a large clitoris, which is illegal to cut? Now, we all have a clitoropenis. We're all born with one structure that diverges in utero, usually after the exposure to certain hormones. And so if it's a long version of this organ, we call it a penis, and if it's a short version, it's a clitoris, and the urethra routes through differently. But in some cases of development, the organ pauses in the middle, and you have something that's neither a penis nor a clitoris. So if you want to draw a sex-based distinction, you're going to have to make an arbitrary line and say, 1 millimeter this way, that's a boy, and you can go ahead and perform medically unnecessary genital cutting. And 1 millimeter that way, we're going to say that's female genital tissue, and now you can go to jail. So the law is not going to be able to draw distinctions on this basis as the principle upon which we decide whose genitals can permissibly be cut. Now, against this view, some might say of male circumcision, as it's often said, well, it's just a little snip, so perhaps it falls below a threshold of seriousness that would lead us to take this seriously as a matter for concern. When people say this, it occurs to me that they must not know what a circumcision involves. If you're in a predominantly circumcising culture, you might not know anything about the tissue that's removed because it will have been discarded on the hospital or the clinic floor. I come from a circumcising culture. I don't know how many people know, but in the United States, it's not primarily a religious practice. It's just a general social birth custom. There's a very interesting history to why that came about. I could happily get into it during the question section. But the point here is that when people think of a little snip, it's because they're thinking of a little baby who has a small penis. So of course, there's not very much tissue that's removed in that initial instance. But this organ grows by about 200% over the lifespan. And so what you're doing is preemptively removing about a third or 50% of the functional skin system of the penis. And that amounts to dozens of square centimeters in the adult organ of sensitive erogenous tissue. So this is the part where I want to show some pictures. And I think it's important to show them because we need to know what we're talking about. It's very easy to talk about a bit of skin or something like that, but if you're not aware of what the surgery involves, it's hard to have an accurately attuned moral judgment to what it is that we're discussing. So the first step in a circumcision is to separate the foreskin from the head of the penis, the glans, to which it's adhered at birth by a membrane. So if you think of the way that your fingernail is adhered to your finger, it's a similar principle. Your fingernail is protecting your finger, and so too is the foreskin protecting the penis. It's keeping contaminants out and so forth. And so in order to separate these structures, what's required is the application of a blunt probe and to then scrape around the head of the penis. Now, even with pain control, if you're in a best case scenario in a hospital, this will still be excruciating to the baby. If you're doing a religious circumcision in the traditional way, no pain control will be used, and so this will be akin to torture. The second step is to apply a clamp, at least if you're doing a hospital, good old American version of this procedure. You apply a lot of force to cut off the blood supply, and then the next thing you do is you excise around the tissue. Now, as you can see, it's not a little bit of skin. Proportionally, it's about half of the skin system of the penis. So people need to know that, because when they're drawing comparisons about different kinds of genital-altering procedures, there's a tendency to minimize what happens in the case of boys. Now, it isn't just physical effects that we should be thinking about. This procedure is happening to a person. It's a young person who can't yet verbalize his experiences, but one of his earliest events in his life is to be strapped into this device called a circumstraint, which to me looks a bit like a torture implement, and to undergo a genital surgery. Now, the point here is that it's a healthy child. The child doesn't have any genital abnormality or disease, which is normally what you would require if you're going to subject a small child to such an event. Now, the manufacturers here have chosen to make the straps blue, which I guess is to play on the gender stereotype that blue is the color for boys, and so this is a thing that we do to boys. But just imagine that the straps were pink, and this was a baby girl that was strapped into this device. I don't think there would be quite as much tolerance for any kind of cutting, and I think that's the right result. In my view, if a girl is healthy, to perform any genital cutting, no matter how slight, would be morally impermissible. And I'll give some reasons for that as I go along. So let's just imagine, to get away from our prejudices and stereotypes about what we think of as FGM based on the kind of Western media accounts, let's think of cosmetic labiaplasty. Now, if your thought is, well, wait a minute, that's different. That's something that consenting adult women might choose for themselves. That's not something we do to children. What I would say is, you're absolutely right. Of course it's done to consenting adult women rather than to children. And I think this issue of consent is really where the whole ethical analysis lies. So what can we learn by thinking about so-called cosmetic labiaplasty procedures? Well, one thing it shows us is that the mere cutting or alteration of healthy genital tissue is not inherently mutilating or net harmful if you want it. If you've decided that you want to change your body on the basis of norms that you endorse, even if others might think that they're problematic and ought to be contested, and maybe they should, but if you decide that you're willing to put up with the risks and consequences on this very intimate part of your body, then to you might consider it an enhancement. When you think of removing quite a lot of tissue from the genitals, another myth needs to be busted here, which is that you can, of course, remove tissue from the genitals without causing sexual disability. Women who have undergone cosmetic labiaplasty still enjoy their sexual experiences. But you might think it should be up to them whether they have this erotogenic tissue removed, because the quality, the way that it feels to have a sexual experience will be different. So too is it the case with the foreskin. You can remove it, you'll still feel pleasure, but the quality of the experience is different, and you might think that should be a person's own choice. So in comparing adult versus infant labiaplasty, I think what becomes clear is that it's the lack of consent that is the wrong. And I want to just flesh this out by having us think through some counter-arguments a person might make, a skeptic of my view, who says, well, there might be medical reasons to perform it in infancy, and these could outweigh the concerns about consent and bodily integrity. So they might say some things like this, which are just, copied and pasted from the arguments that are raised in support of infant male circumcision. And by the way, in societies that practice what they call female circumcision of relatively minor forms, so Malaysia, for example, you'll get these kinds of arguments as well. So let me just run through them. Well, she won't remember it. That's better. I hear that all the time in the United States. So he won't remember it, so it's better to do it then. Well, it'll heal faster. You can start to add to the medical claims. It's cheaper and less risky at this age. You get a nice utilitarian kind of cost-effectiveness analysis. Her future sexual partners will prefer it. Well, that's presumptuous. You don't really know who her future sexual partners will be, do you? It's easier to keep her vulva clean, less moist tissue to trap bacteria. That might even be true, and the claim is frequently raised in genital cutting cultures. Fewer labial injuries during sex. That's got to be true. Lower risk of labial cancer, same principle. She won't have to take time off work or school. Now, okay, but it's her body, so it should be her choice, period. That's the whole ethical analysis. Even if there are these seemingly countervailing medical arguments, it really doesn't matter, because the underlying principle is that it's her body, and it's not just any old part of her body, it's her most private anatomy. So therefore, it should be her choice. So I need to draw a distinction between harming someone, which is one way that you can wrong a person, is by causing them unjustified harm, but you can also wrong a person without harming them in some physical sense. So take the example of sexual assault. If you were to intrude upon someone's sexual integrity without their consent, even if you didn't cause any sort of physical injury, you would still have seriously wronged them by showing them disrespect. Furthermore, if they were asleep and they didn't remember it, that wouldn't make it better. So when people talk about, well, he won't remember it and it was done before, that's not the thing, that's the ethical principle that we should be paying attention to. It's the non-consensual violation of the person's physical integrity. So I'll come back to the legal questions to conclude, but let's just focus on why infant labiaplasty is morally wrong. Is it because of the risk of surgical complications? Is it the predicted effects on sexual pleasure? Is it hygiene benefits? Should we be talking about fewer problems affecting the labia? Is it the degree or severity of cutting? If you remove a little bit more tissue versus less tissue, is the threshold of permissible harm somewhere buried within that decision? Is it which precise part of the vulva you alter? Is that the thing that makes it morally permissible or impermissible? Or is it wrong because it's the non-consensual cutting of the most private part of a vulnerable person's body without urgent medical need? I think that's why it's wrong. And if that's why it's wrong, then of course the same principle applies to genital cutting of other vulnerable persons. In all these kinds of acts, it's the violation of the person's bodily and sexual integrity without a countervailing medical emergency. So let's go back to the first US test case, the one as a result of which the federal law prohibiting FGM was struck down. This concerned this woman, Jumana Nagarwala, who's a member of the Dawoodi Bohra, which is a Shia Muslim sect that's based primarily in India and Pakistan, but has members all around the world, including a community in Detroit, Michigan, where this case was focused. Now, the alleged cutting was done by this doctor in a clinical setting. So again, we need to hold aside the stereotypes that we have of rusty razor blades in remote villages. That's the form that we hear about in the Western media because it's the most shocking, and the media runs on shock power. But in many societies that practice female genital cutting, it's been medicalized. In other words, it's done by physicians in a routine setting under clinical control. Now, the Bohra practice what they call khatna, which is an Arabic word for circumcision, on both the boys and girls within their community for religious reasons, which I'll touch on in a moment. And it's important that I pause on this point here. Most people don't seem to be aware of this, but in virtually all communities that practice ritual female genital cutting, they also practice ritual male genital cutting, usually in a parallel ceremony, most frequently as a rite of passage into adulthood, although the age ranges can vary considerably. So there are no societies on record that single out girls for mutilative genital cutting. And depending on the society, the procedure that's done to the boys or the girls within the group may be more or less severe, carry more or less risk, depending on precisely what is done. And I get the impression when I talk to people about this that essentially nobody knows that, which is astonishing to me. So in this particular community, the typical male operation is indeed far more invasive than the typical female operation, and yet only the female operation was regarded as criminal. So what's done? According to this survey, in most instances, the process for girls involves the removal of a pinch of skin from the clitoral hood. That's the tissue that's analogous to the penile foreskin, at the age of 7. With respect to religious connotations, while the Quran, Islam's holy book, does not sanction female genital cutting, the Dayam al-Islam, a religious text followed by this community, does. Now, we're at the secular forum here, so let's talk about religion. You've probably heard that FGM is not in the Quran, therefore it's not religious. Now, this is a really bad argument for a lot of reasons. One is that male circumcision is also not mentioned in the Quran, and yet no one has any trouble seeing this as a religious aspect of Muslim community life. Furthermore, there seems to be the implication that if it were a religious practice, then it would be okay, or if it were a religious practice, then it would be worthy of our respect. Whereas if it's seen as merely a cultural practice, then the implication seems to be that it isn't worthy of respect and we can dismiss it as something like a bad habit. Now, neither of these claims follow. Something might be a religious practice that is nevertheless worthy of moral critique. And something also might be a merely cultural practice that is central to the way of life of a group of people and might deserve just as much respect as a religious belief or the non-religious beliefs of a secular person who holds something dear. But in this case, it's even worse than that because it's a false premise. For the Dawoodi Bohra, female genital cutting is explicitly a religious practice, and so the premise doesn't hold here. Now, commenting on this more generally, my colleague Alex Myers says that in Sunni Islam, which is a different branch of Islam, two of the schools consider female circumcision, which is this pricking or partial removal of the clitoral hood, to be obligatory, while the other two schools recommend the practice, and the scriptural support for this is no weaker than that for male circumcision within Islam. Thus, if we defer to religious justifications as the thing by virtue of which it's okay or not okay to cut a child's genitals, then circumcision of female as well as male children could be permitted on this basis. Now, this leads to a dilemma. My colleague Ariane Chavisi and I put it this way. If male circumcision should be permitted generally and for any reason, because in some groups it is regarded as an explicitly religious practice, then relatively more mild forms of female genital cutting that are regarded by some groups as religiously required should be given equal consideration and should also be tolerated for all groups regardless of the reason. Indeed, some prominent defenders of ritual male circumcision, as I alluded to, aware of the existing double standard in law, have recently begun to argue that mild forms of female genital cutting should in fact be tolerated. So one example is Alan Dershowitz, the very famous American lawyer based at Harvard, I believe, who counseled the defense team in this Detroit case. So the defense team means the team that was accused, that was speaking on behalf of the accused. And so why did he do that? Well, he apparently is encouraging them to adopt a variation of the Jewish circumcision ritual, a pricking ritual done for conversion if you've already been circumcised. Why? Well, to help them fulfill their religious obligations while protecting the rights of young girls and staying within the bounds of US law. Now, to my knowledge, Alan Dershowitz has never written on female genital cutting in his entire career, and I don't think he has any special concern for the Dawoodi Bohra, but I suspect that he sees the implications for male circumcision, which he is concerned about. And so here he then is weighing in on the side of those who want to cut girls for religious reasons. Similarly, these authors published this Target article in the American Journal of Bioethics. That's the leading bioethics journal in the United States. They were initially well known for arguing in favor of ritual male circumcision, where they claimed that people were selectively applying rights rhetoric in critique of circumcision, ignoring various other elective procedures performed on minors that are at least as invasive and permanent as circumcision, such as sex assignment operations, which we've discussed, and labiaplasty for large labia majora causing pain. Now, I was a reviewer on this paper, and I noticed that they initially didn't mention the causing pain part. And I said, well, actually, you can't just perform labiaplasty on a girl because she has what you perceive to be large labia if it's non-consensual and it's not medically indicated. That just is an assault. And so you have to have a medical reason. Now, whether causing pain is a legitimate medical reason is a whole other discussion, but you can see they've added it in here because you normally would think that if you're going to perform a surgery on someone's genitals, either you have their consent or you have an overwhelming medical reason that can't be delayed. So following their line of reasoning through, the next year these very same authors wrote an article in which they explicitly argued that because male circumcision is tolerated, so too should we tolerate female genital cutting. This is how they put it. We will argue that a liberal society that tolerates expression of culture and or religion in the manner of male circumcision should also permit certain de minimis FGC procedures in non-consenting girls, including ritual pricking and medically unnecessary labiaplasty. We believe this is an appropriate assumption because all Western nations, in fact, permit ritual circumcision of men. I just want to call attention to this very interesting rhetorical move they made at the end here. You cannot ritually circumcise a man without his consent. That would be a criminal assault. What they mean is ritual circumcision of infants, who are, of course, even less able than men to defend themselves against such intrusions into their bodily sphere. Now, The Economist came and weighed in on this debate, taking the side of Jacobs and Aurora. So they said, after 30 years of attempts to eradicate a barbaric practice, it's very easy to throw the label barbaric at the practices of an unfamiliar group without considering, the barbarism that might exist within your own group. But they say it's time to try a new approach. What's the new approach? Tolerating female circumcision, as they would say. So here's the upshot. These and other mainstream sources now explicitly rely on the presumed moral and legal acceptability of non-therapeutic religious male circumcision to justify arguments in favor of what some people regard as minor FGM. Now, I've corresponded with a number of women who have undergone this supposedly minor FGM, and by their lights, it isn't minor. So what you often find is that the people who are claiming to speak on behalf of the community will minimize the harms and complaints of the, as it were, minority within the minority, those who are speaking out and requesting some kind of change. So Davis concludes this way. She says, as long as Western countries continue to countenance MGC, the criminalization of even the ritual nick cannot fail to dilute the persuasiveness of the official stance against female genital cutting while carrying the unmistakable taint of intolerance and double standards. So what happened with the ruling? The judge, Bernard Friedman, made an interesting jurisdictional argument. So he said, the reason why the law is unconstitutional is because in the United States we have a very strict federalist organization, which means that the National Congress is only allowed to do things that have been explicitly delegated to it by the Constitution. And all other acts are meant to be carried out by the individual states, including regulating local criminal activity. The only time that the federal Congress is allowed to pass a law in this area is if it affects interstate commerce. Well, there is no implication that a small number of girls in Detroit were affecting interstate commerce, and so he said the Congress didn't have the authority to pass this law. He very carefully doesn't mention male circumcision anywhere in the ruling, and when you read it, it's just a glaring omission. Here's why. The ritual nick, which was what was at stake in this decision, he says, constitutes local criminal activity because it's a form of physical assault. If you cut someone's body without their consent and without a medical emergency, that's an assault. So if a ritual prick is an assault, what is a male circumcision? So he avoided confronting the gender equality issue at the federal level, but he's clearly just passed it down to the states. So now they're going to have to deal with this in their state laws. That being said, he was clearly aware of the equal protection problem. He said, as laudable as the prohibition of a particular type of abuse of girls may be, it does not logically further the goal of protecting children on a non-discriminatory basis. I think for the future of law and policy, we should think about moving the discussion from the x-axis and determining exactly at what point male tissue turns into female tissue, and we should instead look over at the y-axis, which is about autonomy. And we should say, if a person doesn't have the capacity to evaluate the risks that you're exposing them to on the most private part of their body, then they should be protected from the intrusion into their body, unless you have an undelayable medical emergency. On the other side of things, if you have an adult who thinks that all things considered, taking on this risk is of benefit to them, then they should be allowed to make that decision. Adults can make cosmetic decisions for themselves. Now, there are some feminist groups that are taking up these arguments in a really brave way, and I think Vanguard is the right word here, because they're sticking their necks out against the prevailing discourse that's gobbled up this space over the last 30 years or so. So this is a German group called Terre de Femme, who recently celebrated the Worldwide Day of Genital Autonomy. And their position paper is that whether medical or in a mild way, FGM remains a violation of human rights. Any discussion of whether there could be an acceptable form of FGM is rejected by this organization. And for that reason, analogously, there is no discussion as to whether it might possibly be acceptable to tolerate a boy's genital injury. Thank you.